right, everybody. We have one more session for you before lunch. As a quick reminder, I'm sure you all just saw this, but we do Q&A. There are microphones out there, so don't forget to write your question down and have it ready. And we are running auto transcriptions throughout the day. Now, next up, we are going to talk about how to build an inclusive startup, which is something that has fallen, I would say, a little bit out of the conversation lately. Lots of talk about burn rates, lots of talk about cash preservation, but how to build a company that still works for everybody remains a key topic. So please welcome to the stage Dominic-Madori Davis from TechCrunch and Joelle from Paradigm.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Thank you everyone for coming. First, I see you went to USC, so fight on.
Fight on.
Fight on. Second, DEI has been in the news a lot lately. Some executives are stepping down, and overall it feels like there's been kind of a retreat in companies focusing on this. So I'm really interested to know, how have you seen industry perception around DEI change since before and after 2020?
Yeah, I think we're definitely facing some headwinds around DEI right now in tech and in other industries. I think one is just the economic shift. So I think the sort of power balance shifting from employees back to employers in an economic downturn means that, you know, in 2020 and 2021, when employees advocating for this meant employers had to take it seriously because employees had a lot of power. I think as that power starts to shift, it means that employers kind of start to show their actual values and what they actually care about. I think, you know, another headwind is just sort of exhaustion or inertia as a result of focusing so heavily on this for a few years. I think another is the politicization of DEI, where the term DEI is getting sort of grouped in with a bunch of other themes that are really not at all what we're talking about when we talk about building inclusive and equitable organizations. And then on the back of all of that came the affirmative action decision, which I think gave, while it doesn't govern or apply to companies at all, I think it gave companies who might already want to be stepping back from this air cover to do that. And so, you know, I think what we're seeing right now is that organizations that are, it's sort of a clarifying moment. Organizations that are and have been genuinely committed to building more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive workforces are continuing down that path, are continuing to make progress. And those that might have not ever genuinely cared about this have sort of the air cover to step back.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because we're seeing this play out, or the backlash to DEI play out in the courts now. And I want to know, how far does this influence stretch in terms of like impacting companies who are really looking to bring on a diverse workforce?
I mean, I think it's really scary to see what's happening in the courts. So I think the Fearless Fund case, if folks have seen that, where this group of anti-progress activists that brought the affirmative action case are suing a venture capital firm in Atlanta who had a grant-making program for Black women entrepreneurs. And there's an amazing legal brief in response to that lawsuit that, if you haven't read yet, I highly recommend reading, really making the case for why supporting Black women entrepreneurs is not only not discriminatory, it's both legal and in kind of our collective best interest, given what a tiny fraction of funding Black women get in kind of the venture capital world. But I think that lawsuit, there are 2 lawsuits now pending against law firms for diversity programs. And I think it is really scary. And so, but what I think we shouldn't do is look at those lawsuits and say, all right, we're going to stop everything. I think companies need to start to weigh their sort of risk appetite against their values and think about, if we value DEI, or even if we value building an effective company, if we value contributing to a productive economy, then we actually do need to consider what it looks like to attract a diverse set of employees, to build an inclusive culture, all of these things. But how do we do that in a way that kind of minimizes potential risk? And I truly think that, you know, startups, I've never worked with a startup that is doing anything within its strategy that even comes close to running afoul of the intent behind the affirmative action decision. So I think a lot of organizations are far more worried about this than they should be, given that their efforts really, you know, are not anything approaching affirmative action, right? Things like, hey, maybe we should source from a wider candidate pool. Maybe we should build more equitable practices so that bias isn't driving our hiring outcomes. Maybe we should, you know, put in place some benefits that support people from a range of backgrounds. Maybe we should consider parental leave. These are the types of things that I see startups in particular thinking about at an early stage and are not only extremely low risk, but they're also very high reward things to do.
How early should a company start to map out its company culture plan as it continues to scale and grow?
Yeah, I mean, I think as early as possible, as early as you are more than a couple of people in a room and you're actually like starting to hire, I think culture matters quite a lot. I think inclusion matters quite a lot. I remember we started working with Slack when they were about 75 employees, which is still quite big compared to a lot of the folks kind of at early stages of building. But it was so much easier to help them think about building great culture and attracting and keeping a diverse workforce than it is companies that come to us when they are hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people big. Because the earlier you embed thoughts around culture, inclusion into just the DNA of your company, the less that this becomes some initiative that you have to sort of orchestrate and program around, and the more that it just becomes the way that you operate. And people from a wider range of backgrounds are just going to be motivated to join your company.
What are some key policies that startup founders, maybe in the audience today, should look at implementing, like maternity leave, PTO, as they're building?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is, even aside from policies, thinking about your people and talent practices. So companies tend to be pretty bad at early stages at making sort of rigorous decisions, and because they're moving so quickly, right? It's very easy to just go to your network, recruit from your network, hire the person that you like the most in the interview, and it's tempting to tell yourself that that's a really good way to build companies and build culture, but all the research in the world on human decision making shows that that's a really bad way to make decisions if what we want is to actually hire the best person, to actually promote the right people, create healthy culture. So I would look at your processes. How are we actually being thoughtful about the way that we're evaluating people, both prospective candidates and people within our culture? And then as we think about policies, I think about, I think companies generally are a little bit too late when they start thinking about parental leave, when they start thinking about healthcare, when they start thinking about, if they want to have some kind of mental health support as part of their healthcare policies. And these things are not actually that hard to do. Parental leave can obviously pose some challenges to a really early stage company, but it poses far more challenges if you haven't thought about it, right? Because people still have babies, people still need to take time off, but if you haven't thought about it, you don't have any plans around it, I see that sort of catching startups off guard and making folks scramble. And if you just think about it proactively, communicate about it effectively, it's actually far more easier to navigate, and you'll have a much easier time attracting a wider set of people to your company.
Yeah, something I've always been curious about is, startups are notoriously hardworking environments, but it seems like, this next generation of workers, they really prize mental health and, taking it a little bit easier. Is there a way to strike a balance in terms of, having a startup and having this fast-paced environment while also prioritizing employee mental health?
I mean, I prize mental health. I believe in therapy. It's a really important part of my life. I also prize working really hard. And I think if you want a startup to be successful, you're going to have to work hard. I think people that want a 9-to-5 job are probably just genuinely going to be happier in a company that is more established, because startups are fighting for their life every single day. And I think it just isn't the kind of environment that really lends itself to having really rigid boundaries, which I know are important for a lot of people. And that's valid. And I think if that's the most important thing to you, there might be a type of organization or role that is just better suited to what you're looking for in your life right now. Now, I don't think that means we shouldn't prioritize mental health. That doesn't mean we necessarily need to have arbitrary rules that people are online from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. or always at their phone. So I work pretty hard, and most of the people that I work with work quite hard. But we also think about how do we create an environment of work-life integration. And I think the startups that I've seen do this most effectively are ones that just have sort of fewer unspoken rules and more well-articulated policies. For example, we generally expect folks are going to be online on these times. We know you're going to be working more than that, but these are the times we expect folks to be available or in the office or whatever it might be so that we can collaborate effectively. We don't micromanage time, but we do expect high output, and this is what that looks like. And so generally where I see the more unfairness start to creep in, or bigger challenges around well-being or mental health, is when all of this is just undefined and people are scrambling in a million different directions at once without any clarity. think the other benefit of clarity is it helps people opt in or opt out to your environment based on whether that is the right fit for them. And I don't think we should hide the ball that startups probably are not a 9-to-5 environment. I think we should be clear about that. I think that's okay. And I think it's also totally okay if that is not the right fit for everyone at this phase of their career.
I wanted to go back a little bit to all of this playing out in the courts, because a lot of the legal attacks is against kind of the language, because they were like, the grants are really explicitly for Black women, and the law firm stuff, it was like explicitly for diverse candidates. And so I'm wondering, for founders who are looking to diversify their pipeline to get more of these employees and workers, how do you kind of be less obvious in the fact that you're trying to attract diverse people?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't prioritize that for any kind of legal reason, because these were grant-making programs or fellowship programs that had kind of money-changing hands, and that's not what we're doing in the hiring process. But I would say that I do see a lot of startups get this wrong. They'll like go on LinkedIn and say like, we're hiring for this role and we need more women, so like, would you come apply? No one wants to be reached out to because they are a woman or because they're Latina or because they're Asian or because they're Black, because they're part of the LGBTQ community. So what I would do is I would start to think, how do we cast a wide net to bring in people with identities from backgrounds, with experience sets that we don't have today? But you don't have to tell each candidate like, oh, we want someone that didn't go to, Stanford, and so we're reaching out to you. You don't have to say that. In your outreach to candidates, I think just talking about the type of culture you're trying to build, thinking about valuing people for the unique perspective and experience they bring and being specific about that. But then in your kind of background efforts, making sure that you are reaching out to people from a really wide range of backgrounds. And then when you're communicating with people, candidates, employees, talking about that you value inclusion, that you're trying to build a culture where people from all backgrounds and with all identities can be successful and can thrive and can share in the positive kind of experience that you're trying to build. I think being explicit about that is really important, especially if you're early stage and like haven't quite nailed it yet. So I know a lot of companies are like, we can't really talk about inclusion because we're not diverse yet. And it's like, well, if this is truly a value for you, being explicit about that is one of the ways if you're genuine, you're going to attract people from a wider set of backgrounds and keep the people that you do have and detract people who are going to be negative contributors to that value. Because if we're not explicit about this, a lot of people just might not care a whole lot about building inclusive cultures. If you do, you might not want those people joining your organization. So it's helpful to actually be clear about this if it is a value.
What are some other common mistakes you see startup founders make in terms of wanting to bring an inclusive workforce and then retain them?
Well, I think the retain piece is a common mistake. I see a lot of companies get, relatively good at hiring people and then haven't thought about what does it look like to build a culture where people from different backgrounds can actually contribute effectively and be successful. So, we know there's decades of research that show that diverse teams are smarter, they produce better outcomes, they're more innovative, all these things that are actually pretty helpful for a startup, but only if we create a culture where people can collaborate effectively. The very difference that creates innovation comes from productive conflict, from allowing different opinions. So if we have a workplace culture where no one is able to challenge a prevailing norm, no one is able to ask questions of the CEO, then it doesn't matter how diverse the team is, you're not actually going to get those benefits of diversity. So thinking just as much about culture, if not more, as you are thinking about recruiting. And I think usually startups get that backwards. The other thing is making sure that if you're thinking about diversity, you're thinking about not just representation across your company, but representation in different roles. So it's not great if you have a 20-person company and you have, 18 white male engineers, but you have, a marketing person who's a woman or, just someone on your sales team and that's the one person of color you have. You want to think about representation across your company and within roles. And I think that that's something companies often get wrong too. They're like, look, we've got women. And it's like, well, it's your whole HR team and nobody else. And that doesn't really you're certainly not going to get the benefits of diversity, and that can actually backfire too.
I also want to say, if anyone in the audience has questions, you can stand up at the mic and we'll take them, as we only have 5 minutes left.
Yeah, would love to hear folks' questions if people have them.
But so we've recently been seeing a lot of DEI executives step down from a lot of these big companies. Is that a role that startup founders should look at investing in?
I don't think it's a role you need at an early stage. I think as an early stage founder, you are the owner of culture, just like you might not be hiring an HR leader within your first 15 employees or 20. You really need to think about owning culture and being accountable and responsible for the experiences people have in your organization. I do think it's interesting, though, this dynamic of DEI leaders stepping down. it sometimes feels to me like a little bit of a cognitive bias that we just notice that and are talking about it more than we're talking about leaders in other roles stepping down or changing roles. A lot of the people that have been in these roles, that have been in the news for stepping down, were in those roles for like 4 years. And I don't know what the average tenure is for a director or VP or even, C-suite executive generally in tech, but like 4 years to me is not really newsworthy, like someone stepping down, even if we're seeing it happen in multiple fields. I think what might be more newsworthy is this person's leaving their role and it's not being backfilled. And I think that is happening in some companies. But otherwise, it seems like the kind of general pattern of talent moving from one place to another, and people in DEI roles should have as much of a right to do that as anyone else. I will say I do think that this role can produce burnout faster than a lot of roles because of the level of responsibility and accountability. So a lot of companies make the mistake of thinking that DEI leaders should be accountable for outcomes, when those leaders actually don't control who every VP is hiring and what the culture is. They are enablers of those things, but I shouldn't be held accountable if our head of engineering didn't hire anyone from a wide range of backgrounds, didn't hire any women last quarter. I didn't control those hiring outcomes. So that's a real challenge of this role, and I do think that can lead DEI leaders to burn out faster than other roles.
And I'll ask one more before someone has a question. Remote work is known to be very helpful for marginalized communities, but at the same time, there's been this massive push back into the office. And so how should startup founders kind of rethink that back to office strategy?
That is the question, huh? I don't know, and I think I'm very interested how the future will look back on this moment in history. I love remote work. When the pandemic hit, our company leaned into being remote first. I have 2 young kids. It's incredibly valuable for me. There is a lot of research, as you say, that people from underrepresented racial and ethnic backgrounds have reported experiencing far fewer microaggressions and other barriers that make being in a workplace sometimes more challenging. I also think humans are not meant to be in isolation, and I think we can see engagement suffer when we're working remotely. We can also see certain biases like proximity bias and distance bias actually escalate in fully remote environments. So while it might feel better, I don't know that the data are clear yet that it actually is better for outcomes like promotion rates and compensation and growth into leadership. I think it'll be interesting to actually see if remote work was in total better for people from underrepresented and marginalized groups. But I think at the end of the day, each company is going to have to figure out an approach that works for the culture that you're trying to build and lean into that. And if you are kind of a remote first environment, really thinking about how do you mitigate against some of those biases? How do you build an inclusive culture? How do you stay connected, particularly to people from underrepresented backgrounds who we know are more likely to sort of be subject to those kind of types of proximity and distance bias? If you have an in-person culture, how do you be thoughtful about the fact that people have families, that people might be experiencing more microaggressions when they come to work day to day? How do you create an environment that allows people to work in person together effectively? I think they're just different challenges, and I don't think we know yet. I don't think the data are clear on what the right answer is, if there is one.
And we have an audience question.
Cool. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Nice. I lead engineering recruiting at a startup and fortunately have buy-in from the founders to support this kind of thing. But what advice would you give if you're having trouble getting buy-in from middle management?
Yeah, I think it's really important to tell the story of why this is important. I think we lean often very heavily on data, and there's tons of data to show that diverse teams are more innovative, more effective, all these things. But I think it's also really important to tell the story of what it is that you're trying to do, of the fact that if you ever get to scale, then you will need to be able to be a place that's attractive to people from a range of backgrounds. And if you've got 20, 30 engineers that all look the same, it's going to be very hard to hire that first person. So if we're hoping to ever build an effective company or a scaling company, we're going to have to think now about getting more representation in the door. I also think talking about how getting a range of perspectives benefits you in kind of designing and building products, and thinking about DEI less as an outcome in itself and more as a tool for helping you build an effective company overall. Your product is not very meaningful if nobody buys it, right? The best ideas aren't very meaningful if you can't really execute on them effectively. So really making sure that you're talking about why this matters. And I think telling the story also of the fact that diversity, equity, and inclusion, they actually benefit everybody. So it's not just saying, hey guys, we want to bring in more people who don't look like you. That doesn't feel so great. But hey, we want to bring in people that are going to enable us all to do our best work, that are going to unlock innovation here. We want to build a culture that allows all of us to thrive. We want to be thinking about how we build a culture that scales into the future. So really talking about the impact that you're trying to achieve through this. And I think the shorthand of we just want to bring in more people from backgrounds different than yours, it can make sense when the conversation lands like that people don't feel so great about it. So really reminding people of the outcomes that you're trying to drive.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
And we have another audience question.
Yeah, I know that a lot of organizations are struggling with layoff decisions. How does diversity play a role in that?
Yeah, I think organizations need to think just as much about representation in downsizing as they do in hiring. What we've seen over the past couple of years is that in the past year in particular is that layoffs in tech have had a disproportionately negative impact on women and on people of color. And so really making sure that as you're thinking about downsizing your team, if you are in that position, you're thinking about the impact that that would have on representation, the impact that will have on culture. Similarly with, and I know it's a lot of earlier stage folks in here, acquisitions, thinking about acquisitions, that also affects the representation of your team. So thinking broadly about all of the things that affect who's represented in your organization and how different decisions you make are going to impact diversity and impact people's perceptions of what your company values.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I guess my last question is, how can companies fight back against those who are trying to make DEI harder to achieve?
I think really doing a better job talking about why this is important to you and not shying away from talking about this. I think if we all stop talking about this, sort of the Overton window on the expectation that this is a part of corporate culture and a part of tech culture and a part of startup culture shifts in a way that I think will set us back a couple of decades. So for the folks in this room, if this is something that you care about, being the champions that talk about this when you're in meetings, talking about it with middle management, advocating for it, talking about it with your peers at other companies, talking about why this is important. I'm very worried that if we stop talking about this, we're gonna, as the pendulum swings back to people wanting to see this more in companies and employees having more power, all the companies that sort of paused on this are gonna have a very hard time attracting and retaining and building effective companies. So I would say keep talking about it now, and you'll be in a much better position as the kind of cultural focus, inevitably, as it always does, shifts back to this conversation.
Yes, and thank you so much for coming today. That is all we have time for, but we will be continuing this in the TC Plus Lounge, I believe. So thank you again for coming.
Thanks, Dom. Thank you all.